The final photograph. Chapter 1. The accidental shot. Edward Hartman arrived in Heidelberg in early spring. The air was still cold, but the sun gave the city a soft glow. He had been sent by an American magazine to capture the beauty of old European architecture. Heidelberg was known for its castle, its narrow streets, and the famous Karl Theater Bridge. Edward had photographed many cities before, but this one felt different. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and the people seemed careful with their words. He didn't speak much German, but he understood enough to notice the tension in the air. Something was happening beneath the surface. Edward was 41 years old. He had worked as a photographer for nearly 2 decades. He was calm, focused, and preferred to stay behind the camera. He didn't chase fame or attention. He believed that good photography was about patience and detail. He liked to walk alone, observe quietly, and wait for the right moment. His camera was always with him, hanging from his shoulder like a trusted companion. He had learned to see things that others missed: shadows, reflections, small movements. He believed that every photo told a story, even if the story was hidden. One evening, Edward went to the Karl Theater Bridge to take pictures of the river and the old stone arches. The light was perfect. The sky was clear, and the water reflected the buildings like a mirror. He set up his tripod and began to shoot. He focused on the lines, the textures, the way the bridge connected both sides of the city. He took several photos, adjusting the angle and exposure. As he prepared to leave, he noticed a car parked near the edge of the bridge. 2 men stood beside it. One wore a dark uniform. The other looked nervous. Edward didn't think much of it. He took one last photo, then packed his equipment and walked back to his hotel. Later that night, Edward went to the small darkroom he had set up in his room. He began to develop the film. He worked slowly, carefully, watching the images appear on the paper. Most of the photos were as expected, beautiful shots of the bridge, the river, and the city. But one photo caught his attention. In the corner of the frame, almost hidden by shadow, was the scene he had barely noticed. The man in uniform was pushing the other man into the car. The victim's face was clear. He looked terrified. His eyes were wide, and his mouth was slightly open. Edward felt a chill. He looked closer and saw a symbol on the arm of the man in uniform. It was not familiar, but it looked official, maybe military or political. Edward stared at the photo for a long time. He hadn't meant to capture that moment. It had been an accident. But now the image was real, and it raised questions. Who were these men? What was happening? Was it a crime? A political arrest? Edward didn't know. But he felt something was wrong. The photo was not just a picture. It was a piece of truth. A moment that someone might want to hide. He placed the photo in a folder and locked it in his suitcase. He didn't sleep well that night. The frightened face stayed in his mind. The next morning, Edward walked through the city with a different feeling. He looked at people more closely. He listened to their voices. He noticed the posters on the walls, the uniforms on the streets, the way some people avoided eye contact. He felt that the city was hiding something. His job was to take pictures of buildings, but now he wanted to understand what was happening behind them. The accidental shot had opened a door. Edward didn't know where it would lead, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. He had seen something important. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Chapter 2. Suspicion. Edward Hartman walked through the streets of Heidelberg with the photograph hidden in his coat. The image stayed in his mind like a shadow. He could not forget the frightened face of the man being pushed into the car. He had not planned to get involved in anything dangerous. He had come to Germany to take pictures of buildings, not people. But now, he felt something was wrong. The photo was not just a mistake. It was a message. And he was the only one who had seen it. He decided to visit a local newspaper office. It was a small building near the center of the city. The editor was a man in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes. Edward showed him the photo and explained what he had seen. The editor looked at the image for a long time, then slowly shook his head. He said it was too dangerous to publish. He warned Edward to be careful. He said that people were watching and that some things were better left alone. Edward left the office feeling uneasy. He had hoped for help, but instead he found fear. That night, Edward sat in his hotel room and thought about what to do. He looked again at the photo. The man in uniform had a symbol on his arm that Edward now recognized. It was connected to a political group that had grown stronger in recent years. He remembered hearing stories back home about arrests, about people disappearing without a trace. He wondered if the man in the photo was one of them. He wondered how many others had vanished without anyone noticing. The more he thought about it, the more he felt he could not ignore it. The next day, Edward went to the university. He asked questions, careful not to say too much. He spoke with students and professors, pretending to be interested in the history of the school. Slowly, he learned that a man named Joseph Wald had recently gone missing. He was a mathematician, respected by many, and known for his quiet opposition to the new government. Some said he had simply left the city. Others said he had been taken. No one knew for sure. But when Edward saw a photo of Joseph in an old university brochure, he felt a chill. It was the same man from his photograph. Edward began to feel watched. He noticed the same man standing near the hotel 2 days in a row. He saw a car parked outside that did not belong to any guest. He started to take different paths through the city, avoiding open spaces. He kept the photo hidden in a book, and the negatives in a second camera bag. He trusted no one. He knew now that what he had seen was real. And someone else knew that he had seen it. He thought about leaving, about returning to Paris or even going back to America. But something inside him said no. He had the truth in his hands. He had proof of something terrible. If he left now, the photo would mean nothing. But if he stayed, maybe he could find out more. Maybe he could help. Edward was not a hero. He was a man with a camera. But sometimes that was enough. He decided to stay. He would search for Joseph Wald. He would follow the trail, even if it led into danger. Because now, it was not just a photograph. It was a responsibility. And Edward Hartman was not ready to walk away. Chapter 3. Traces. Edward Hartman walked through the gates of Heidelberg University with quiet determination. The campus was peaceful, with old buildings and tall trees lining the paths. Students moved between classes, carrying books and speaking in low voices. Edward blended in easily. He wore a simple coat, carried a satchel with his camera and notebook, and kept his eyes open. He had come to learn more about the man in his photograph, the one being pushed into the car. He now had a name: Joseph Wald. Edward began by visiting the mathematics department. He asked polite questions, pretending to be interested in the history of the university. Some professors were helpful, others cautious. One older man mentioned Joseph Wald with respect. He said Joseph had been brilliant, quiet, and deeply thoughtful. He had taught advanced mathematics and had written papers that were admired across Europe. But he had also spoken against the growing political power in Germany. He had warned students to think for themselves and not follow blindly. Edward listened carefully and took notes. He spoke with students who had attended Joseph's lectures. They described him as kind but serious. He had encouraged questions and had often stayed after class to help. Some students said he had stopped coming to the university a few weeks ago. No one knew where he had gone. One student whispered that Joseph had been taken in the night. Edward asked what that meant, but the student walked away quickly. It was clear that fear lived in the halls of the university. Edward returned to his hotel and looked again at the photograph. Joseph's face was clear, full of fear and confusion. Edward felt a growing sense of responsibility. He had captured something real, something dangerous. He began to write down everything he had learned. He created a timeline, marked locations, and listed names. His work was no longer about buildings and light. It was about truth. He was following traces, small pieces of a story that others wanted to forget. But Edward also noticed changes around him. He saw the same man near the university 2 days in a row. He noticed a car parked outside his hotel that didn't belong to any guest. He felt eyes on him when he walked through the market. He began to change his habits. He took different routes each day. He stopped carrying his camera in plain sight. He hid his film rolls in books and behind furniture. He kept his notes in code, using symbols only he understood. He started visiting places quietly, asking fewer questions. He listened more than he spoke. He visited the library and searched for Joseph's published work. He found articles about mathematics, but also short essays about freedom and thought. Joseph had believed in reason, in peace, and in the power of knowledge. Edward felt a connection to him, not just through the photograph, but through the values they shared. Joseph had used words. Edward used images. Both had tried to show the truth. Edward's investigation grew deeper. He found a small cafe where Joseph had often met with friends. The owner remembered him and said he had stopped coming suddenly. Edward asked if Joseph had left anything behind. The owner gave him a folded piece of paper with numbers written on it. Edward didn't understand the meaning, but he kept it safe. Every detail mattered now. Every trace was part of the puzzle. He knew he was being watched. He knew he was in danger. But he also knew he could not stop. Joseph Wald had disappeared, and Edward had the only proof of what had happened. He was not a detective. He was not a spy. He was a photographer who had seen something important. And now, he was following the traces of a man who had tried to speak the truth in a time of silence. Edward Hartman had become more than an observer. He had become part of the story. Chapter 4. Connection. Edward Hartman continued his quiet search through Heidelberg. He walked the streets with care, visited libraries, and listened more than he spoke. He had learned to move without drawing attention. He no longer carried his camera in the open. His notebook was hidden inside his coat. He had become cautious, not out of fear, but out of respect for the danger around him. He knew that every step could be watched, every question could be noticed. But he also knew that he could not stop. The photograph he had taken was more than an image. It was a piece of truth, and truth needed protection. One afternoon, while reading in a small library near the university, Edward met a woman named Lena. She was in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that seemed to see everything. She worked quietly, organizing books and helping students. Edward noticed her calm movements and the way she looked at people. She was careful, but not afraid. He asked her about Joseph Wald, expecting another polite refusal. But Lena paused, then nodded. She asked Edward to follow her to a quiet corner of the library. There, between shelves of old science journals, she spoke in a low voice. Lena told Edward that Joseph had been part of a small group of scientists and thinkers. They were trying to preserve their work, papers, formulas, ideas, and send them abroad before everything was lost. The group believed that knowledge should survive, even if they did not. Joseph had been one of the leaders. He had collected documents, hidden them in books, and passed them to trusted people. Lena had helped him. She had hidden papers in the library, sent messages, and protected names. She said Joseph had been taken because he refused to stay silent. Edward listened carefully. He felt the weight of her words. He showed Lena the photograph. She looked at it for a long time, then closed her eyes. She said it was proof. It showed what had happened to Joseph. It showed the fear, the violence, the silence. Lena said the photo could help others understand. It could be used to warn, to speak, to remember. Edward felt a deep sense of responsibility. He had not planned to be part of this. He had come to take pictures of buildings. But now, he was holding something that mattered. He knew he had to protect it. Edward asked Lena how to get the photo to a safe place. She said there were people in Paris who could help. Journalists, scientists, and writers who were trying to collect stories and evidence. She said the photo needed to leave Germany. It was not safe here. Edward agreed. He would find a way. He would send the photo, the negatives, and the story. He would make sure it was seen. He didn't know how yet, but he knew he had to try. Lena gave Edward a small book. Inside were names, dates, and locations. It was part of Joseph's work. She said it had to go with the photo. Edward took it and promised to protect it. He felt the weight of the book in his hands. It was not just paper. It was memory. It was truth. He left the library with a new purpose. He was no longer just a photographer. He was a messenger. And the message was clear. Silence was dangerous, but memory could be powerful. Edward walked through the city with new eyes. He saw the fear, the control, the quiet resistance. He saw people who wanted to speak but could not. He saw buildings that held secrets. He knew that his photo was part of something bigger. It was not just about Joseph. It was about everyone who had been forced into silence. Edward had captured a moment, and now that moment had become a mission. He would protect it. He would carry it. And he would make sure it reached the light. Chapter 5. Danger. Edward Hartman sat alone in his hotel room, staring at the small envelope that held the film negatives. The photograph of Joseph Wald being forced into the car had become more than just a picture. It was now a piece of evidence, something that could expose a crime. Edward had tried to stay calm, but the city around him had changed. The streets felt colder, the faces more guarded. He knew he was being watched. He had seen the same man near the hotel entrance 3 times in 1 week. He had noticed how the receptionist no longer smiled. He understood that his actions were no longer secret. He had arranged for a courier to take the negatives to Paris. Lena had helped him find someone she trusted, a young man who worked in the train station and had made deliveries before. Edward gave him the envelope and a note with instructions. He watched the man walk away, hoping the film would reach safety. But 2 days passed, and there was no word. Lena returned to the library with worry in her eyes. She said the courier had not shown up for work. No one knew where he was. Edward felt a deep fear. The film was gone, or worse, it had been taken. That night, Edward returned to his hotel and found the door to his room slightly open. Inside, the drawers were pulled out, the bed was moved, and his suitcase was open. Someone had searched the room. They had not taken anything obvious, but Edward knew they were looking for the negatives. He checked his camera, his books, and his coat. Everything looked normal, but he no longer felt safe. He sat down and thought carefully. He needed to hide the remaining negatives. He needed to protect what was left. He took one of his notebooks, removed the pages, and placed the negatives inside. Then he wrapped the notebook in plain paper and tied it with string. The next morning, he met Lena in the library and gave her the package. He told her to keep it hidden, somewhere no one would look. Lena nodded and said she would place it inside a book that no one borrowed. She chose a thick volume on ancient mathematics and placed it deep on a shelf. Edward felt a small sense of relief. The photo was safe, for now. They planned to meet at the train station the next evening. Edward had decided to leave Heidelberg. He would go to Switzerland, then to Paris, and try again to share the story. Lena said she would bring the notebook and meet him at the platform. Edward arrived early, watching every face, every movement. The train was on time, the platform busy. But Lena never came. He waited until the train began to move, then stepped back into the shadows. Something had happened. He didn't know if Lena had been stopped, or if she had chosen not to come. He only knew that time was running out. Edward returned to his hotel and packed quickly. He kept only what he needed. He felt the pressure growing. The city was closing in. The photograph had become dangerous. It was no longer just a memory, it was a threat to those who wanted silence. Edward knew he had to act fast. He had to leave before it was too late. He didn't know who he could trust. He didn't know if Lena was safe. But he knew one thing: the truth had to survive. And he was the only one left to carry it forward. Chapter 6. Escape. Edward Hartman woke before sunrise. The streets of Heidelberg were still dark, and the air was cold and quiet. He packed his bag slowly, choosing only what he needed: his camera, a few rolls of film, his notebook, and a small envelope with the last negatives. He placed the envelope inside one of his shoes, under the sole, where it would be safe and hard to find. He dressed simply, like a traveler, and left the hotel without saying goodbye. He knew he could not stay any longer. The city had become dangerous, and the silence around him was growing louder. He walked to the train station with steady steps. He had bought a ticket to Switzerland the day before, using a different name. He had memorized the route and the stops. He avoided eye contact and kept his coat closed. At the station, he waited quietly, watching the people around him. He saw two men in uniform near the entrance, speaking to passengers and checking papers. Edward felt his heart beat faster, but he stayed calm. When it was his turn, he handed over his passport and ticket. He smiled politely and said he was a tourist, visiting Europe to photograph old buildings. He showed a few prints of bridges and castles, nothing unusual. The officer looked at the photos, then at Edward's face. He asked a few questions, but Edward answered with simple words. He spoke slowly, like someone who didn't know much German. After a short pause, the officer nodded and let him pass. Edward walked to the platform and boarded the train. He sat near the window, watching the city fade into the distance. He didn't relax until the train crossed the border. Only then did he breathe deeply and feel the tension leave his shoulders. In Zurich, Edward found a small hotel near the center. He stayed in his room most of the day, thinking about what to do next. He had the negatives, the notebook Lena had given him, and the story of Joseph Wald. He knew the photo was important. It showed something real, something that needed to be seen. He contacted a magazine he had worked with before, one based in Paris. He sent a message explaining the situation, without giving too many details. He asked if they would be willing to publish a story about a missing man, a photo, and the danger of silence. 2 days later, he received a reply. The editor said they were interested. They asked for the photo, the notes, and anything else he could share. Edward prepared everything carefully. He wrote a short article describing what he had seen and learned. He included the photo of Joseph, the list of names from the book, and the timeline of events. He didn't add emotion or opinion. He let the facts speak. He sent the package by courier and waited. While waiting, Edward walked through Zurich, taking photos of quiet streets and old buildings. But his mind was still in Heidelberg. He thought about Lena and hoped she was safe. He thought about Joseph and the others who had disappeared. He knew he had escaped, but the story was not finished. He had carried the truth across the border, and now it was in the hands of others. He had done what he could. He had used his camera not just to capture beauty, but to protect memory. Edward sat by the window of his hotel room, looking at the city lights. He felt tired but calm. He had taken a risk, and he had survived. He didn't know what would happen next, but he believed the photo would speak. He believed someone would listen. And he knew that sometimes, escape was not just about running away. It was about carrying something important to a place where it could live. The final photograph was safe. And now, it was ready to be seen. Chapter 7. Publication. Edward Hartman sat in a small cafe in Zurich, holding a copy of the International Journal in his hands. The cover was simple but powerful. Inside, on page 3, was his photograph. The image of Joseph Wald being pushed into the car was printed in black and white, sharp and clear. The article beside it told the story of a missing man, a respected mathematician, and the growing fear inside Germany. Edward had written the piece himself, using only facts, dates, and careful words. He had not added emotion, but the photo spoke for itself. It showed fear, injustice, and silence all in one frozen moment. The response came quickly. Within days, letters began to arrive at the magazine's office. Some were from readers who had never heard of Joseph but were moved by the image. Others were from people who had known him, former students, colleagues, even distant relatives. They thanked the magazine for publishing the story. They shared memories of Joseph's kindness, his intelligence, and his quiet courage. One letter came from a professor in Belgium who had once worked with Joseph on a research paper. Another came from a woman in Prague who said Joseph had helped her brother escape the country. Edward read each letter with care. He felt the weight of their words. The photograph had reached people. It had opened a door. Edward stayed in Zurich for a few more weeks. He walked the streets with his camera, but he no longer saw only buildings and light. He saw people, faces full of questions, voices full of stories. He took fewer photos, but each one had more meaning. He had changed. He was still a photographer, but now he was also something more. He was a witness. He had seen something that others had missed, and he had chosen to speak. That choice had made a difference. The magazine printed a second article, this time with more details. They included parts of Joseph's writings, quotes from the letters, and a short note from Edward about the risks he had taken. The editor called it, "The Power of One Image." It was shared in other countries, translated into different languages, and discussed in small circles of journalists and academics. Edward did not seek attention. He did not give interviews. But he knew the story was growing. He knew the truth was moving forward. He received a letter from a young man in Paris who had read the article and wanted to help. The man said he was collecting stories from people who had escaped Germany. He asked Edward if he had more photos, more names, more information. Edward replied with care. He shared what he could, always protecting those still in danger. He knew that every word mattered. Every detail could help or harm. He worked slowly, with patience and respect. Edward began to understand something important. The camera was not just a tool for art. It was a tool for memory. It could freeze a moment, protect it, and carry it across borders. It could speak when people could not. It could hold truth in a world full of lies. Edward had always believed in light and shadow, in composition and timing. Now he believed in courage. He believed that even one photograph, taken by accident, could become a voice. He continued to work, but his purpose had changed. He no longer looked for beauty alone. He looked for meaning. He looked for stories that needed to be told. He knew that danger still existed, that silence still covered many places. But he also knew that truth could be heard if someone was willing to show it. And Edward Hartman had shown it. He had taken a risk, and the world had listened. The final photograph had become more than an image. It had become a light in the dark. Chapter 8. Resolution. Many years had passed since Edward Hartman had left Germany. He had continued his work as a photographer, traveling across Europe and later returning to the United States. His name had appeared in journals and exhibitions, but he never spoke much about Heidelberg. The photo of Joseph Wald had become part of history, printed in books and studied in classrooms. People remembered the image, but few knew the full story behind it. Edward carried that story quietly, like a weight that never left his shoulders. He had done what he believed was right, and that was enough. One spring morning, Edward returned to Heidelberg. He was older now, with gray hair and slower steps. The city looked different. New buildings stood beside old ones, and the streets were filled with young voices. But some places had not changed. The Karl Theater Bridge still crossed the river with quiet strength. The university still stood with its tall windows and stone walls. Edward walked slowly, remembering the days when he had searched for answers, when he had felt fear in every corner. Now, he felt something else, peace. He visited the library where he had once met Lena. The building was quiet, filled with the smell of old paper and polished wood. He walked to the mathematics section, where Lena had hidden the notebook years ago. He searched the shelves until he found the same thick book on ancient mathematics. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside, between 2 pages, was a small envelope. It held the original negative of the photograph. Next to it was a folded piece of paper. On it, in Lena's handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for the light." Edward sat down and held the note for a long time. He didn't know what had happened to Lena. He had never heard from her again. But she had kept the photo safe. She had believed in its power. And now, after all those years, Edward understood something deeper. The photo had not only shown a moment of fear. It had become a symbol of resistance, of memory, of truth. It had helped people remember Joseph Wald and others like him. It had given voice to those who had been silenced. He walked through the city one last time, taking quiet photos of the streets, the river, and the faces of strangers. He no longer searched for danger or secrets. He looked for light, for signs of change. He saw students laughing, books being read, and people speaking freely. The city had moved forward. The past had not been forgotten, but it had been faced. Edward felt proud, not of fame or recognition, but of the choice he had made. He had chosen to see, to act, and to share. Edward returned to his hotel and placed the negative and the note in his journal. He wrote a few lines about the visit, about the feeling of coming back. He knew he would leave the city again, but this time without fear. He had done what he could. He had shown that even one person, with a camera and a sense of justice, could change something. Not everything, but enough. Enough to make a difference. Moral: sometimes truth hides in small details. One photo can say more than 1,000 words. And if we choose not to look away, we can become the voice for those who were forced into silence. Edward had looked. He had listened. And because of that, history had one more light. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.